Evening, everyone. Welcome to the last talking history of 2020. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Christy Kokiki. I'm the Director of Public Engagement at the History Trust of South Australia. And I've been lucky enough to be bringing you these talking histories all year. So before we do anything else, I'd just like to acknowledge that the land that we are broadcasting to you tonight from is the land of the Kaurna people, and I'm coming to you personally from Kaurna land, as is our fabulous History Trust tech team behind the scenes. I'd also like to acknowledge that the History Trust of South Australia respects the primary place of Aboriginal people in the history of this place. We acknowledge that our story commenced long before Governor Hindmarsh proclaimed the new province of South Australia in 1836. Aboriginal land and sovereignty were not recognised, and that building a shared understanding of our history is crucial to reconciliation and to creating a positive future for us all here in South Australia. I want to introduce Danielle Claude, who is a scholar and creative writing academic, and she's published popular books on killer whales, bushfires, natural history, museums, and fossils. She has a particular interest in the history of science and the natural history of French voyages of discovery to Australia and the Indo-Pacific region. Her award-winning account of French voyages of discovery to Australia, titled Voyages to the South Seas, was made into a documentary, which we had the privilege of screening for Talking History earlier this year. And in her latest book, In Search of the Woman Who Sailed the World, I'm told is now available in all good bookstores and online. So you might want to go up and Google that after the session. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Danielle, who's going to talk about Circumglobal and Upwardly Mobile Life of Jeanne Barret, the first woman to circumnavigate the world and complete her journey in 1775. So thank you, Danielle.
Thank you, Christy. That's a lovely introduction. And I'm really excited to be back here talking at the History Trust again for a second time this year. I feel very privileged to have had a second run. Some of you might remember the documentary that Christy mentioned that I did earlier. But so I really would like to thank the History Trust for inviting me back. And I'd particularly also like to welcome delegates from the Bibliographic Society of Australia and New Zealand, who I know some of them have tuned in, and also the David Nichols Smith Seminar in 18th Century Studies, who's joining us as well. So it's a really diverse group of people, and seeing the chat and seeing where everybody's coming from is really amazing. Having people from all over the world, that's really phenomenal. So thank you for joining us. So yes, my earlier talk this year was about voyages of French discovery to Australia and the Pacific, and today I'd like to talk to you about one of those French voyages, the first of those French voyages really into the Pacific in more detail. The Circumglobal and Upwardly Mobile Life of Jeanne Barret. Now, the voyage Jeanne Barret sailed on was the Bougainville voyage, and this was notable for a number of reasons. So the Bougainville voyage was the first French circumnavigation to be completed. That was part of the reason for the French government sending it out. But it was also the first voyage to specifically employ a scientific team. And this was a feature of the French voyages that became quite characteristic of them, that they always had quite a strong team of scientists on board, particularly naturalists, but also astronomers and often artists and people like that. So the Bougainville voyage had a naturalist and an astronomer, which is why I'm particularly interested in being interested in the history of science. But it was also unexpectedly and unintentionally the first known circumnavigation of the globe by a woman. And I say known voyage because, of course, there could have been other women on other ships whose voyages were not recorded. Women, we typically, when we think about tall ships and sailing ships, the age of sail, we don't really think about women being present at all. It's very much depicted as a man's world. But they were actually much more common on ships than history would have us believe. They were present as wives, girlfriends, passengers, lovers, cross-dressers, sailors, and they served in armed conflicts, in the infirmaries, in the kitchen galleys, and even in the rigging. but their full stories are very rarely documented. They just tend to be mentioned in passing, but not actually described in detail or given full attention. And it almost seems like their stories have been suppressed or ignored, which is an interesting phenomenon. And the story of Jeanne Barret herself may well have only become known because Bougainville mentioned him in very briefly, little more than a page in total, I'd say, in his best-selling narrative of the voyage. So what I'd really like to talk to you about today is not just the story of this remarkable woman and how she came to sail around the world and be the first woman to sail around the world, but also the changing construction of that story from the fragments of information that we have and how that story has changed over time. And how we've filled in the missing pieces. So I'm interested in the published history of Jeanne's story, the bibliographic record, and how that interacts with the broader historical narratives we tell. So what did Bougainville say about her? Well, initially, this is what he wrote. While we were in Vanuatu, I had the opportunity of verifying a very singular fact. For some time, there was a report that the servant of Monsieur de Commerson, named Barret, was a woman. His shape, voice, beardless chin, and scrupulous attention of not changing his linen or making the natural discharges in the presence of anyone, besides several other signs, had given rise to and kept up this suspicion. But how was it possible to discover the woman in the indefatigable Barret, who was already an expert botanist, had followed his master in all his botanical walks amidst the snows and frozen mountains of the Magellan Strait, and had even on such troublesome excursions carried the provisions, arms, and herbals with so much courage and strength that the naturalist had called him his beast of burden? So it's a good question, really. How was it possible to discover the woman in the indefatigable Barret when she didn't dress like a woman and she certainly didn't behave like one, or at least not a woman they expected? And how the young woman managed to disguise herself for so long on a relatively small ship crowded with over 100 young men? To answer this question, it's helpful to know a little bit more about ships and sailing, which is, to be fair, an area not a lot of historians are familiar with. So I spent a lot of time actually visiting replicas mostly of these ships, because most of them haven't survived, to find out more about how the ships operated and how they worked and how people might live on them. And if we look at these ships, it makes me wonder how she slept with the crew in hammocks slung above a crowded mess. You can see how they're very tightly packed. And more importantly, the question that often arises in this conversation is how she went to the toilet. So if we look at this picture here, you can see this is called the heads, and this is actually where the ship's toilets were. So they're little more than a plank in this section here behind this bit of woodwork, where you can imagine a row of generally men sitting there doing their business. So not a lot of privacy on these ships. It's hard to imagine how a woman could have concealed herself. Probably one of the answers to these mysteries must lie in her unique position on the ship, because Jeanne Barret was not a sailor on this ship. She wasn't a member of the crew. She was a servant, and she was a servant to Philibert Commerson, who was the ship's naturalist sent aboard at the recommendation of the Museum of Natural History in Paris, very influential organisation in these voyages. And Commerson's role on the ship was to collect specimens and make general observations of natural history. Now, Commerson was really quite a high-ranking person, and his position on the ship can be gauged by his salary, which was the highest on the two ships of the expedition. There were two ships, so only Bougainville himself earned more than Commerson, and even the ship's captains didn't earn as much as Commerson. So he was really a very high-ranking individual. And like most servants of the 18th century, Barret's status on the ship was very much attached to that of her master. So the servants on ships typically occupy a kind of in between. They're not crew, they're not officers or aristocrats, but they sit in between those two places. So they occupy a slightly ambivalent place in the social hierarchy. And they very much set themselves as separate from the sailing, the people, the sailor, the crew. So as a result, she wouldn't have slept in the same quarters as the crew. She would have shared the officers' quarters with commissants. So servants usually stayed in the same area as their master, as it's put. So often in a little separated cubicle. So they'll be in the captain's servants, for example, will be with the captain, and they've got a little canvas bunk that is just got a curtain across it. So still not a lot of privacy, but it's not in with everybody else. This brings me to another archival source that's very frequently overlooked by historians, and that's the specimen records themselves. And I think these tend to get overlooked because they're classified as being scientific, and so therefore people tend to not think of them as an archival historical record. Now, while much of Commerson and Barret's collections from this voyage were lost, the plant collections have survived. They've survived very well. And they were preserved in the herbarium at the Paris Natural History Museum, and they're now accessible through an international digitisation program. In fact, an enormous quantity of herbarium specimens are now digitised and available for you, so you can search them for any number of remarkable things. And they come up as these beautiful high-resolution images. Now, there are thousands of Commerson and Barret specimens annotated over time by various people. You can see in these pictures that there's handwriting on here. They're written by different people. It doesn't always say who's written on it. They're different botanists have written on them as they get reclassified and renamed. But often there's also the original writing on them from the original botanist. And so some of these are written in Commerson's hand and some of them are not, but they're identified as being part of Commerson's original collection. So these were the very specimens that Jeanne would have collected, prepared and dried on the voyage. And yet her name almost never appears on them, and it doesn't appear in the digital catalogue as one of the collectors either. And that's probably because she was only a servant, so she didn't warrant a mention. So as soon as the ships crossed the Atlantic and arrived in South America, the true nature of this biological collecting task became apparent. Commerson and Barret collected a vast amount of material from South America. It was very much still an undiscovered area, and there was a lot of new material to collect. And the jungles of South America were particularly rich, are particularly rich. So they collected a lot of material around Montevideo and Buenos Aires, but also in the Strait of Magellan. It has to be remembered, though, that Commerson was plagued by a leg injury at this time. So, and it was so severe that Bougainville even banned him from going ashore because he was afraid the naturalist would overextend himself and not allow his leg to heal, and that he might lose the leg from gangrene. Like a lot of these French naturalists, Commerson was excessively enthusiastic about his task and often didn't look after himself very well. So in any case, the fact that he wasn't able to go ashore for a lot of the time does suggest that a large amount of the collecting work was done in South America was probably being done by Jeanne Barret. And that probably does include the famous Bougainville, which is the most famous specimen collected from this voyage, which was named obviously after the commander. So the vast quantity of specimens that Barret and Commerson amassed soon created issues for the other officers. So they were housed in the shared officers' quarters initially, according to Commerson's own letters. But once they started collecting specimens, the officers weren't so keen on sharing their quarters with these people anymore. Biological collections smell quite bad. So for those of you who are gardeners, it's a mix of blood and bone and sea salt. Even the plants can be a bit smelly, and they certainly take up a lot of space. So the officers complained, and the captain of the ship, who was a Breton officer, had a very solution to this problem. And he just simply gave up his own cabin, the captain's cabin, which you can see in this picture, images of the captain's cabin of a very similar ship. and he gave up his cabin for to the naturalist and his servant and collections, and moved himself in with the officers, and that solved that problem. Now, it's possible that at this stage there were rumours of Jeanne's identity circulating on the ships. That's not entirely clear. People claimed after the voyage that they had always had rumours or had suspicions about her, but nobody actually said that at the time in their journals, so it's not really clear whether they did or not. But even so, if there had been rumours, giving Commerson his own cabin would have solved a lot of those problems and kept Jeanne in a safer position. In particular, this also resolves the issue of the toilet, because on most of these ships, the captain's cabin is one of the few places where there's a private toilet. So this is a little room that's built on the side of the ship, just on the across the back of those big windows that run across the stern of the ship. There's a little cabin on the side, and that's basically a long drop. So, and also it would have to be the toilet with the best view ever, I think, off the back of one of those ships. So, but it certainly would have afforded Jeanne a lot more privacy and security. And of course, in the field, she would always have been in Commerson's company, not only in his company, but also quite well armed. She always carried guns and knives because that's what naturalists needed to carry. It was part of their standard equipment. So perhaps it's not so unfeasible that she could have kept herself concealed. After the ships left the Strait of Magellan, and that was a very difficult time for them, it was extremely cold and extremely miserable, and Jeanne worked extremely hard while she was there. They must have been looking forward to getting into the Pacific and finding warmer climates to work in. And their first port of call was Tahiti. And this must have seemed absolutely idyllic, filled with fascinating natural history treasures, all undiscovered, unresearched. And also they had a fairly enthusiastic welcome from the Tahitians, particularly from the young and very beautiful Tahitian women who seemed to show a great deal of interest in the young Frenchmen on board. So this generated quite an interesting lot of publications around Tahiti that depicted it as a kind of utopian paradise. And there was much discussion about the sexual and social freedoms that Tahitians enjoyed. And both Bougainville and Commerson wrote about this. Commerson especially was very enthusiastic about Tahiti. And that certainly promoted a lot of Enlightenment ideas around the noble savage and utopian societies. These accounts probably tell us a bit more about European culture than they do about Tahitian culture. And it has to be said that in the aftermath of colonization and disease and Christian evangelism in Tahiti and other Polynesian cultures, it's really hard to try and unpick or understand the role that open sexual relationships played in many Polynesian societies. So trying to interpret what exactly is going on with the arrival of this French ship and the Tahitian people is a little bit unclear. I'm not an expert in that area, but it is clear that just as the Tahitian women were interested in French men, the Tahitian men were also actively seeking out women on the ship. And this is quite a common interaction that Indigenous communities have when Europeans arrive. They're often looking for the women. Not in the Tahitian case, there was a sexual interest, but in other cases, it's simply wanting to know where the women are, because people who are traveling without women probably don't have good intentions. All male parties tend to be war parties, whereas parties traveling with women and children are generally safer and traveling for other reasons. So that's probably why that was of particular interest. Either way, the Tahitian men were very keen to see if there was a woman on the ship, and lo and behold, they found one. So if we go back to Bougainville's commentary again, he writes, Monsieur de Commerson went on shore to botanize there, Barret had hardly set his feet on shore with that of the herbal under his arm when the men of Tahiti surrounded him, cried out, "It's a woman," and wanted to give her the the honorary customs on the island. So they were obviously quite enthusiastic about getting to know her better. Now, from here, Bougainville goes on to recount Jeanne's own version of how she came to be on board and why. So he says when he came on, which is the other ship, he was not on the ship that Commerson and Barret were on. Barret, with her face bathed in tears, owned to me that she was a woman. She said that she had deceived her master at Rochefort by offering to serve him in men's clothing, at the very moment when he was embarking, that she had already before served a Genevan gentleman in Paris in the quality of a valet, that being born in Burgundy and becoming an orphan, the loss of a lawsuit had brought her to a distressed situation and inspired her with the resolution to disguise her sex, that she well knew when she embarked that we were going around the world and that such a voyage had raised her curiosity. So this is Jeanne's, as close as we can possibly get to Jeanne's own account of her reasons for being here. There's nothing written in Jeanne's own hand. She doesn't tell her own story. It's not recorded. So Bougainville's recording of this is the closest we can get. So she's describing herself as a reasonably respectable servant brought low by a legal dispute, and who disguises herself as a man in order to look after herself and continue a career. And she's very clear about noting that she's the one who has deceived Commerson. He knew nothing about her identity. So I think she's establishing a number of points here. First, she's laying claim to a particular social class of being a respectable servant. And secondly, she's absolving Commerson from blame, which is important because it's illegal for men to bring women on board the ships according to the naval laws of the time, but it's not technically illegal for a woman to embark on a ship. So that's probably a sensible move. So this is the story she wants Bougainville to believe, although if we look closer, we find that elements of it are not all entirely accurate. And those specimens collected that also tell a very interesting story. So while there are thousands of specimens collected from South America, the specimens collected from Tahiti are really slim. They were only there for 2 weeks, but that should be plenty of time to make a good collection. And I could find no plant collections at all from Tahiti, which really surprised me. I could only find fish and birds, which is interesting because we know Commerson was ashore and we know that Jeanne was confined to the ship. So whatever Commerson was doing ashore, it didn't involve plant and animal collecting. And I think he was probably preoccupied with quite another branch of biology at the time. So Commerson and Jeanne both leave the expedition in Mauritius. And as far as Bougainville's concerned, that's the end of the story. He doesn't pursue this any further in his book. And Commerson continued his natural history work with new assistants. He had young men like Josny and Sonore to assist him. But the question is, what was Jeanne's role here now that her cover as a man has been blown and she'd returned to, it was an outpost of French society, but, a normal, conventional location otherwise. So what happened to her and what happened to her a few years later when Commerson died in Mauritius, and she was left effectively on her own. And this is where there are significant gaps in Jeanne's story, and there's a tendency in the storytelling here to fill in the gaps with conventional expectations about how a woman should behave. I just want to take a little diversion here and talk about the images that are drawn of Jeanne, because there is no image of her drawn from life. There's no image of Commerson either drawn from life, actually. The image is actually apparently an artist's impression. But the one people are most familiar with is this one. And this is generally the one you see if you search the internet for Jeanne Barret. But it was drawn by an Italian artist probably long after her death for a book of famous voyages. And I think this image is mostly allegorical. It represents her voyage rather than being an actual illustration of a real person. And the reason I think this is because of some of the details of the drawing. First of all, she's dressed as a sailor. She's dressed in typical sailor's clothes: a blue pea coat, loose striped pants, lightweight slippers and stockings. These are clothes described from the time. But we know she wasn't a sailor. She was a servant, so she wouldn't have ever worn sailor's clothes. She would have worn similar clothes to a gentleman, probably old versions of Commerson's clothes, for example. And the hat too puzzles me because this is I think a red bonnet is characteristic. It's said to be characteristic of Mediterranean sailors. It's not a characteristic of Breton sailors, though, and it was Breton sailors who were on the ship. What that red cap really makes me think of, though, is the cap of liberty worn by Marianne, which is a symbol of revolution. And it's very much associated with revolutionary France, which was long after Jeanne's journey. And so I think here Jeanne's being represented as a young adventurous woman seeking her freedom by associating her with this allegorical figure of Marianne. Now, the other thing that concerns me is the plants laid over, limply dangling over Jeanne's arm. Now, there's just absolutely no way any botanist ever collects plants like that. That's just not how it works. The plants are usually, when they're collected, they're immediately placed between sheets of paper so that the specimens are kept separate from each other. And this is described quite clearly in the descriptions of Jeanne that were written at the time, that she was always carrying a herbal or a plant press and lots of paper. And so she certainly wouldn't have draped a bunch of flowers over her arm like this. So I don't think this is a real image at all. The only other image of Jeanne Barret, which was drawn much later, is one from Jules Verne's book on great voyages. And Verne, I know he's obviously fiction, but he actually had a real passion and fascination with French voyages, so he knows an awful lot about them. And you can see that this picture, which depicts Jeanne in Tahiti, is it has her wearing much more conventional gentleman's attire. So she's not wearing sailor's clothes here. She's normal gentlemanly clothes of the period. You can see she's got the kind of equipment we'd expect a botanist or a naturalist to have: a large bag, lots of sheets of paper. So this seems to me to be a much more accurate image, even though it's a very dramatic image. So in the same vein, I had a new image of Jeanne illustrated, which is drawn from the descriptions that we have of her. And this image by Tim Ide shows her with a plant press under her arm. It might have been a little bit bigger than that, possibly, with papers, with lots and lots of bags, because naturalists always carry lots of bags and little sacks of cloth to put things in, lots of pins and knives and equipment like that, and also the weapons that she would have carried, because a naturalist always has to shoot things. So she would have been responsible for doing that as well. So back to thinking about what she was doing in Mauritius. Similarly, in the absence of evidence about what she was doing in Mauritius, we get stories that come up about what she was probably doing. And the biographers and descendants of Commersons are the ones who constructed their own version of events, which was published in the late 1800s. And they wrote in biographies of Commerson that Barret cared for Commerson until his last hour, during the days of his health and the days of his sickness. She closed his eyes in his last moments, and after his death, she married a soldier named Antoine Barnier on the Ile-de-France, which was Mauritius. And back in Europe, she came to end her days in Châtillon-des-Doms, which is Commerson's hometown. She survived her husband and had the delicacy, in respect for the memory of her former master, to bequeath her entire fortune to his direct heirs. Now, I think this story is based on a misreading of archival documents, but it also reads to me as an attempt to sanitize Commerson's story and remove any hint of misbehavior on his part, because they knew, I'm pretty sure they must have known at the time, that Jeanne was known to Commerson before the voyage and before they left France. And there was a hint of impropriety about it. So it's Commerson's own will, which was published soon after his death in 1773, that reveals that he did know Jeanne Barret and that she was a woman well before the voyage, because his will states that I leave to Jeanne Barret, known as de Bonnefoy, my housekeeper, the sum of 600 livres paid in one amount. There are wages I owe from the 6th of September 1764, as well as all the bed, the table linen, all the women's dresses and clothes, and all as such other furniture therein, such as beds, chairs, armchairs, tables, chests of drawers. So she was clearly living with him, and he is leaving her, a reasonable amount of money after he dies. And that publication did give rise to some slightly salacious commentary from other publications along the lines of she knew her master's bed better than his kitchen. And I suspect that's what the biographers of Commerson are reacting against. So that's the state of Jeanne's known story up until throughout the 19th century, as a solitary, loyal servant who devoted herself in life and after his death to her master. And it wasn't until the late 20th century that Jeanne started to receive any direct attention in her own right. And then it was mostly from female researchers. So in the 1980s, a regional historian in Burgundy, Henri Dussaud, uncovered important new information. Dussaud uncovered a legal document signed by Jeanne Barret just 5 days before she arrived in Paris with Commerson. And in this document, Jeanne states that she is working as a domestic servant in Toulon-sur-Arro, the town where the recently widowed Commerson was working as a local doctor. As required by French law for unmarried women, Jeanne was making an obligatory declaration that she is 5 months pregnant. She doesn't name the father of the child or her employer. There's no mention of Commerson in this document. But the signatories are a local wealthy landowner and a medical doctor who attended the same medical school as Commerson. So this really does raise some suspicions about the nature of Jeanne's relationship with Commerson. There's not really many other explanations as to why Commerson would flee from his town to Paris with a heavily pregnant housekeeper, other than that he's the father of the child. Dussaud also uncovered Jeanne's birthplace, the parish records of the very small town of La Comelle to the north. And it's here that we find that Jeanne was actually born into the very lowest class of French society, a class of mostly illiterate peasants who were not even entitled to own property. Everything they possessed, everything that they managed to save, if they could save anything, on their death returned to the lord of whoever's land they lived on. So it's unlikely that she was a valet who had lost money in a lawsuit. In actual fact, I think it's pretty clear that she had pulled herself up from the very bottom of French society. Dussaud also published new information on where Jeanne lived in Paris with Commerson, and it was in this second floor apartment in a street which is just a short walk from the Paris Natural History Museum in the Jardin des Plantes, where Commerson sought work. And that building is obviously still there, although the inside has unfortunately in the 90s was all renovated, so it has no historical interest anymore other than the location. Jeanne must have given birth to her child in Paris, but unfortunately the Paris records for Paris were all lost in the Commune fires of 1871. Dussaud did uncover a child with no parents listed, born at around the same time and left at the Enfant Trouvé, which was the Paris foundling home, which is just right in front of the Notre Dame, was right in front of the Notre Dame Cathedral. And this child was listed under the name of Jean-Pierre Barret. So Jeanne's father was Jean, and her brother was Pierre, and repeating names was a feature of many French families at this time. Jeanne's mother and sister were also called Jeanne, which must have made dinner time conversations extremely confusing. Leaving children at the foundling home sounds terrible, but it was extremely common at the time, both in France and in England, at a time when child mortality was extremely high and there was an awful lot of poverty. But it was also a common way for men to avoid a scandal. Rousseau is a classic example of this. Voltaire revealed that Rousseau had left his 5 children by his long-term working-class partner, Thérèse Lavassier, to the foundling home. Jeanne may have intended to collect her child at a later date. That was also a common thing to do, but it seems likely that, like many children, this child died a few months after birth. And here's a picture of a mother depositing a child at the foundling hospital in Paris. So this fills out more of the story about Jeanne's life before she appears in the French port town of Rochefort, which is depicted here in one of the fabulous series of harbour scenes painted by Joseph Vernet between 1754 and 1765. I have to say, documentary paintings like this were a major source of information about life at the time. That's also, I think, perhaps not used as much as it could be, because these paintings not only provide information about shipbuilding and fitting out, but also about clothing of the times. And one of the interesting features of Vernet's paintings is that he includes a lot of women in them, even though they are around ships and ports. But by the end of the 20th century, we still didn't know very much about what happened after Jeanne's journey. We know she returned to France because she was awarded a state pension for her services to France in 1785. And this document tells us that she married a man called Dubonnet and lived in his hometown of Dordogne. So we know that the story told by Commerson's biographers has some flaws. Of her time on Mauritius, though, the only information we have is a tiny mention of her name in the legal records, where a young woman going by the name of Barret is fined for serving alcohol on a Sunday. And so this is a very passing reference. And it's not even entirely clear that it's Jeanne Barret, but it's assumed it was. So what can we make of this? Well, quite a lot, it seems. And I'll just read you something that I came across in an article based on this evidence. And Commerson is saying that Commerson died in Mauritius, leaving Barret to shift for herself, alone, homeless, penniless, and unable to pay her way back to France. She worked as a barmaid for at least some of the following year, and in the end married a French army sergeant who took her back to France and a quiet life in 1774 or 1775. So yay, she's been rescued by a man. I just think this is really interesting that we should assume, and I'm as guilty of this as anyone else, that because a woman is fined for serving alcohol in Mauritius, she must therefore be penniless on her, last ends and desperate to make a living because she's been abandoned by her partner, and she needs to find a man to rescue her and take her home. And this use of, and that's a really common stereotype that we come across. So it's not really surprising that it's been used. And this use of stereotypes to fill in the gaps comes to a peak in Glenys Ridley's biography, which was written about 10 years ago. And she relies on another common stereotype, similar to the one that we've just heard, which is that adventurous girls must come to a sticky end. That's what happens. If women go out and have adventures, they tend to meet a bad end. And really argues that Jeanne's Tahitian discovery is a cover for a much darker version of events that took place in New Ireland, near this spectacular waterfall, which was drawn on another French voyage by Duperrey. And this happened a few weeks after the Tahitian encounter. Now, the evidence for this is from the journal of Vives, the doctor on board, that Jeanne was accosted by other servants on the ship who wished to confirm Jeanne's true identity for themselves. The evidence in the journals is a bit vague and hard to interpret. It's very poetic, I guess you'd call it. But we have two opposing sources of evidence, one being Commerson himself, who didn't like Vives at all, and Vives did not like Commerson. So it does seem to be confirmed, but they confirm that although the incident was unpleasant and unwanted, Jeanne suffered no lasting harm. So Commerson says she emerged unscathed with her virtue intact. That's his specific words. Ridley, however, argues that this was in fact a gang rape, and that several events that are described in Bougainville's voyage journal or narrative, including the event with the Tahitians, as well as a sailor being bitten by a sea snake, were an elaborate cover for this crime. I won't go into the details of why I don't think this is the case, but she also claims that an interpreter mentioned by Matthew Flinders many years later, called Bonnefoy, which was the name Jeanne used in Paris, must have been the child of this rape. Now, I did quite a lot of research around this. There's no evidence of there being a child born in Mauritius. There's no evidence of a rape. We have to remember rape was punishable by death on French ships. Bougainville had explicitly told everybody on the ships that Jeanne was not to be harassed, so this would have been a major threat to his power, I guess, a major contravention of his orders. So I'm just not convinced that this could have happened without it appearing in any of the records, and especially not in Commerson's letters, because Commerson complains a lot in his letters at any slight, so I can't see that he would have not found some obscure way of complaining about this, and there isn't anything. So I think this is another argument of falling into a conventional stereotype where we have to assume that women are going to meet a bad end when they go on an adventure, because that's what always happens. How do we get out of avoiding this pitfall of falling back on stereotypes and conventional narratives, particularly when we're thinking about women who have unconventional lives? And I think the only way we can do this is to go back to the archives. I really need to get a wiggle on. I can see my time slipping away here. So we need to double check all the records. And from this, we learn that she's not isolated. She's not an orphan. She actually did have a mother. She had a family, and she remains in touch with her family even when she comes back to France, and she brings them to live with her. When she's living in Mauritius, she's granted land. This isn't organised by Commerson or by Bougainville. It's probably just organised by herself. She has a house probably a little bit like these old houses in Mauritius, and she runs a bar. We can see from the newspapers of the time that she was indeed fined for serving alcohol on a Sunday, but she wasn't a barmaid. She actually owned the bar, and it was an expensive bar. It was one of 5 highly sought after licenses in Mauritius. She would have been making a lot of money out of that bar, and she was penalised £50, which was a fairly hefty fine. And I don't actually think she would have had any trouble paying that fine, because when she married Dubonnet, she had amassed so much money and such a considerable fortune that she required him to sign a prenuptial agreement acknowledging her wealth and what she was bringing to the relationship, which was considerably more than Dubonnet brought to the marriage. So it wasn't that Dubonnet was rescuing her, she was actually the catch. And when they returned to France, where the wife's property all becomes part of the husband's property, Dubonnet signed another document saying that half of all he owned was the property of his wife. So she didn't meet a sticky end. She actually became wealthy, became a landowner, became a very successful farmer and trader. She knows her rights and ensures that others respect them. And she spent the rest of her life comfortably and successfully surrounded by her family in Dordogne. And she's buried in a marked grave in a little churchyard in Dordogne, which is more than most explorers get. We know that a lot of them have no graves to speak of at all. And I think that this tells us that there are many conventional tropes we might like to attach to Jeanne's story. We could picture her as a woman of science or a product of the Enlightenment, but I don't think that that's entirely true. She did all this botanical work, but there's no evidence that she had any interest in it. In the long run, there's nothing in her assets when she died to show that she retained her interest in botany, other than a surprise. Nothing reminds us of her voyage at all in her Dordogne possessions, other than a surprisingly large stockpile of clothes and food, which are two things that she would have suffered greatly from the lack of on her voyage. We could picture her as an example of social mobility, picking herself up from a deprived peasant childhood and making her own fortunes. But I just think she's so much more than that. She's not just a character that fits into conventional stories, either fictional or historical. She's an individual, she's exceptional, and she's unusual. And I think we really need to recognize the full diversity of these individual stories, rather than trying to force them into conventional narratives, because if we do that, we just don't get to recognize that full range of human experience. So I think I will leave it there because I've talked far too long already, and I'm going to go back to our host, Christy.
Oh, thank you very much, Danielle. That was fascinating. What a lovely story about, you know, the ocean or the sea and science and collections and this really exceptional woman. Just a reminder to people to start putting your questions for Danielle in the Q&A, and we will get her to answer those questions for you all. Yeah, I was particularly taken, I guess, as a museums person myself, just how you've pieced together the fragments of this story over time and through archives and herbariums and museums, and that you draw so heavily on those objects and that documentary record, and that you're thinking quite critically about those sources and about, you know, when they were created and where and how they were documented and some of those biases. It's not the first time this year, actually, in Talking History that we've kind of considered the role and responsibility of scientists and curators and museums and collecting institutions in documenting and perhaps perpetuating some of these myths and stereotypes. So I was fascinated. It was it's a fantastic talk. Now I'm going to attempt to keep an eye on the chat and the Q&A, but please put your questions in the Q&A. So Danielle, we have got a question here. How satisfying is it to find the crucial documentation to bust the myths that have built up around women's stories?
Well, I actually was really surprised to find new information, new archival information. I wasn't expecting to be able to do that. I was expecting to be able to tell something from the scientific side of the story, because that's an area people don't talk about, but I wasn't expecting to find new parish records, because it was literally a matter of turning 2 or 3 pages in the parish records and there was her mother, and a few more pages and there was her brother. So they weren't particularly hidden. It's just that they hadn't been looked for before. And of course, there's lots of things like that in history that haven't been looked for. But I guess that's the thing about women's history, is that if we don't bother looking at it, you're never going to find it, because women tend, you know, a lot of women, especially women like Jeanne, they don't leave you a nice set of archives ready for somebody to come and research. You have to dig for them yourself.
Yes, and I mean, you spoke a little bit about, I think it was, did you say in the 1980s that there was an increase in particularly female researchers investigating some of this, or, you know, going down the rabbit holes and actually using the source material to plug the gaps, as opposed to, you know, relying on stereotypes and tropes to do that work. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, about your...
Yeah, I mean, I only really noticed the other day that it was predominantly women who had done that research, and I think the thing was that she was always described in terms of the Bougainville voyage or in terms of Commerson's life. She was never investigated in her own right, and so nobody was looking before or after the voyage. People would say, "Well, I wrote about her just from the voyage, and the rest of her life isn't relevant," but you can't really interpret who she was as a person unless you know the rest of her life. And in actual fact, the voyage was obviously going to have been important to her. She made her fortune through that, but I don't know that it was particularly important to her personally. It doesn't seem to have been. Doesn't, you know, it gave her wealth, but she didn't retain a lasting fascination for shells, which I would have loved to have found that she did, but she didn't. Or plants or Mauritian food or any of those things. So yeah, it was a means to an end for her, I think.
Yes, and it sounds like she did amass considerable wealth in the end, which is, yeah, remarkable. There's a question from Gillian Dooley. How did you find the Mauritius information? Are the archives well indexed there?
I did go and do research in Mauritius, but I wasn't looking for Jeanne Barret at the time. I was just interested in all the French voyages. So when I came to look for Jeanne Barret's records, some of the archives are digitized, and some of the information I found the land title through the digitized records. So digitization has been an absolute amazing resource for me, and I'm very fortunate to be at a position in history where that's available. But then the archives went down. They decided to redo their database, and they disappeared for 6 months. Which was really inconvenient. But Gillian Dooley actually put me in touch with a wonderful historian in Mauritius who was willing to go in and do some research for me by hand, and he was the one who found the marriage contract, which was really crucial for understanding what had happened in Mauritius.
Yeah, fabulous. I'm personally and professionally really interested in the importance of digitization of records in archives and collections and museums and others. So can you give us a sense of the proportion of records that you were able to access because they'd been digitized versus the ones where you had to be on site? And
look, I had to go to the Paris Natural History Museum. It's a terrible thing to have to do, but to look at Commerson's archives, because they're huge and they aren't digitized. And I didn't even get through all of the ones I should have, even as it was, because I just ran out of time. But all the parish records are digitized in France pretty much. So that's a huge, as I said, the Mauritian archives and all a lot of the scientific records. So all those specimens are digitized. But the things that aren't digitized are Commerson's biological notebooks. His journals have been transcribed and published. And this is one of those things about historians being interested in history and personal accounts, but not interested in the science. And actually, his scientific notebooks, I think, are the place where there's going to be more information. Unfortunately, it's written in Latin, which is even harder for me to manage than French. So that's probably another impediment. No.
Well, impressive that you're able to manage that at all. That's fabulous. So, okay, so we've got a comment here. Okay, in terms of her hiding her gender, and so someone's asking, do you think it's useful to consider her life in the context of other cross-dressing women?
Yeah, look, obviously this is a complex history, and we have the issue of whether women are actually wanting to be men and living their life as men, or whether they're simply choosing to dress as a man to avoid some of the problems of being a woman, so that they can go on a ship, and that's actually quite difficult to know from the current position. But we do know that cross-dressing wasn't that uncommon. There's research done in the Paris archives by Arlette Fage, which talks about women who are arrested. Usually it's illegal to wear men's clothes, it's an offence. And there are women who are arrested for wearing men's clothes, and not having any women's clothes in their possession, which is it's very dubious. And their defence is quite vigorous. So I recall one account where a woman objected that she was an honourable and virtuous woman. She had served in the French army as a man, as did a number of her predecessors. Her mother and her grandmother had also done this, and this was a family tradition. And basically, they should just shove off and leave her alone because she was a good woman and she was doing what was a family tradition. So I think it was more common than we might think in that context.
Yeah, thank you. There's someone who I noticed this person was having some technical difficulties at the beginning of the lecture, but who missed the introduction. But could you kind of give us a bit more insight into what drew you to research this story in the first place?
Yeah, well, because I spent a lot of time on boats as a child. So I actually lived on a boat when I was a kid. My parents lived on a boat and we sailed around quite a lot. And so I was always a big fan of maritime fiction. And I noticed in those accounts that there were no women in them, or, the women usually died really quickly when they appeared, which was kind of disappointing. So I guess I was always sort of searching for a place for women in those stories. And that tends to draw me to the presence of women on these ships. And when I was writing my earlier book on French voyages, I noticed that a lot of those voyages had a woman on board in various guises. So there might be a stowaway or a lover or a wife in the case of Rose de Freycinet, or a couple of women who actually dressed as men and signed on. So despite the fact that they were not allowed, they still found their way there, and Jeanne is the first. She's the role model for the rest.
Yeah, quite a nice role model, actually. So yeah, there's a question here from Susan. How is Jeanne celebrated or memorialized in France or in her local town? Like, are her achievements actually recognized, or is she better recognized and known in the English-speaking world?
No, she's well known in France, and the story, some of these stories, the Glenys Ridley book is not as enthusiastically received in France. It's not published in French, I don't think. I haven't been able to find a French version of it, so that's just in English. But in her hometown, she has the town hall is named after her, the main street is named after her, there's a sign at the church describing her achievements, so that town is known as the Jeanne Barret's birthplace. Toulon-sur-la-Roe down the river, there's a promenade named after her. So yes, she's quite well known there, and also in the Dordogne region where she spent her later life. She is known, and in the churchyard there's a big sign about the explorer Jeanne Barret and her fame. I think French voyages generally to the Pacific are not as well known. The explorers are known; they've got streets named after them in Paris, but often the French didn't make such a big fuss about their explorers as the English did. The English are extremely good at making a big fuss about their explorers. And Cook is a classic example of that, of the way that narrative has been constructed and polished by the British authorities. And probably that is in response to Bougainville's voyage, which his narrative was a huge bestseller. And so Cook was sent out quite closely. So those French and English voyages are sort of working in competition with each other. But I think the English did a better job of selling their story in history.
Yes, that's a very good point. Look, thank you, Danielle. We're now over time. Apologies, but we've just had a fair few questions to get through. So thank you for all sticking around, and thank you, Danielle, for giving your time. I understand what I didn't do at the start was to give a bit of a shout out to those of you who are here either in Adelaide or joining virtually for the conference, the 2020 conference, the Bibliographical Society of Australia and New Zealand. So I understand you've all been rather busy. So thank you very much for giving your time tonight, Danielle, and thank you to all of our interstate and international visitors who have tuned in tonight. I'm not sure we've had such a diverse international following, so it's fabulous. Just a reminder to everyone that Danielle's book is available at all good bookstores and online. So if you don't have a copy, go out and order one. If you would look in terms of wrapping up for Talking History itself, so if you'd like to know more about Talking History in 2021, please go to our website, history.sa.gov.au, and sign up to the mailing list or follow us.
Sorry, I just also wanted to add that some people who watched the documentary that I did earlier in the year, that's hopefully coming on SBS soon. So keep your ears peeled for that one too.
Brilliant. Oh, thank you. That's really good information. So we will endeavour to push that out on our socials too once it's available, if Danielle can let us know. Brilliant. Okay, and then follow us on our socials. We will get a recording of this session up very soon, within the week, hopefully. And just want to say a real, just a thank you to all of our supporters at the History Trust and for Talking History this year as well. It's been a funny old year for all of us. And it's been really lovely to have this community continuing to join with us and share in our love of research and history and museums. But so the History Trust is really privileged to have this community, this Talking History community that tunes in every month. And so we're just really, really thankful that everyone has played a part in maintaining this sense of connectedness through 2020 with us. So thank you all very much. And we will be back in 2021 with a bigger and better Talking History and probably some other ideas that we're cooking up. So thank you again to Danielle. Thank you again to all of our audience for tuning in. Have a good night and have a very good rest of the year. And we will see you back here for Talking History in 2021. Thank you.
Thank you.